tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. So we began talking a couple weeks ago about the ideas at the root of the Buddhist body of thought and practice known as the Mahāyāna, or the Great Vehicle. And we did this partly out of a desire to investigate some of the deep roots of the engaged Buddhist inspiration in the 20th century, the 21st century, and to begin to tease apart some of the ancient threads that inform our ideas we may have about serving others, liberating others, serving the world in the role of the Bodhisattva, if you use the traditional word. And so you know me, and the thing that I do when I want to discover where something comes to is I find the oldest stories I can about that thing and start there. And that means that we don't always make it to the 20th century. I'll try, we'll do what we can. It reminds me of this beautiful college program, rather traditional or conservative a little bit, college program that I knew back in the day. I knew a couple of folks who went through this program in their undergrad at a place called St. John's College. The one I knew was in New Mexico. And I think there's a couple of them. And their practice was to study the classics, and they figured that they would mature students into modern citizens by starting with the European classics and working their way slowly forward. And so the freshman class, would read Plato and the Greek philosophers, and they would, and it would kind of take the whole first year to make it kind of up through Plotinus, essentially. And it would take the second year to kind of make it through Seneca and the Romans, and the third year to make it maybe to the Renaissance. And people who went through the program, they would say, like, this, what a marvelous experience, like, to do these seminars and actually think along with the development of European thought, from the Greeks forward. But they would often say, like, and so I've been there for 4 years. I'm going to graduate this year, and we've just barely made it to the 18th century, and we're reading Voltaire. Because if you want to get from Plato to now, you have to skim quite a bit or skip quite a bit. And so I worry about this with myself, where I'm like, I want to look at the roots of the engaged Buddhist movement. So I'm going to start with the Perfection of Wisdom in 8,000 lines from the 1st century before the Common Era. And it takes a while to get through 8,000 lines. Like, trust me, we won't go line by line through it. I know you are Bodhisattvas of great faith, but I might lose a few of you if I try to do that. But I at least want us to have a felt sense of some of the root concepts of this thing, because it is tremendously influential, and these ideas become the basis for so much that we'll develop later. And then we'll skip a whole bunch and we'll kind of leapfrog our way to some other influences. The Perfection of Wisdom in 8,000 lines is, scholars think, the first of several Perfection of Wisdom texts, and it gets expanded to different numbers of thousands of lines or stanzas, all the way out to 100,000 stanzas, and then it contracts back down. There's a 250 stanza version, which is the Diamond Sutra. There's a 25 stanza sutra that is the Heart Sutra. We'll get onto that. Maybe we'll do some chanting of that sometime soon. But the 8,000 line version is kind of the the foundational text in these. And these are written texts. So unlike the Pali Canon, they weren't preserved in oral tradition. So they're not repetitive and versy in the same way. They are long prose narratives that also have verse counterparts, but they're not as easily memorized, as the discourses, the suttas and the Vinaya. So the perfection of wisdom is thought of mythically. So that's the historically how it came about is that, some hundreds of years after the Buddha's death, monastics, I think, and along with some scholars, think it's most likely that these were mystical authors writing about visionary experience in deep meditation. And they begin to write these extraordinary new texts about teachings of the Buddha and these new beings that are called Bodhisattvas, that are tremendously powerful. It becomes a kind of new class of divine or semi-divine or awakened or nearly awakened powerful beings. And so that's the historical idea about where these things originate. The mythic idea is that somewhat early in the Buddha's ministry, he is preaching near a place called Vulture Peak. The town is Rajgriha in central North India, in his area, near Magadha, where he practiced and taught, and that on Vulture Peak he both gives a number of discourses that are in the Pali Canon, in the early canon. They're in the Chinese Agamas, straightforward discourses on practice, the way that we look at in the early Buddhist tradition, but that he also gave discourses either in settings where most of his monks weren't there, or in subtle realms, astral planes, heaven realms, slightly altered planes where more supernatural kinds of beings were assembled. And Mahāyāna traditions will eventually come to call this language didn't come into a little bit later, but they will eventually start to call this the second turning of the wheel, where the first turning of the wheel was the initial teaching of the Four Noble Truths, the Middle Way, and the Eightfold Path that the Buddha gave to his 5 ascetic friends in the deer park at Sarnath immediately after his awakening, or shortly after his awakening. And that turning of the wheel includes then all of the conventional teachings that he gave through his life that are collected in the early scriptures. The second turning is a phrase that describes the bodies of practice and understanding that come out in this new wave of literature, right? So mystically or mythically, the Buddha gives these teachings a little bit in secret during his life, because most people would not get them, and his ordinary monks who were concerned with renunciation and purity and practice and ethics and maintaining the Vinaya and all of these things, that they would not understand. And we get this sense right in the beginning of the text that the one who is unafraid when hearing this teaching is a true Bodhisattva. And so the implication is that, the Buddha's monks, with their orientation toward renunciation, purification, etc., they would not like this. They wouldn't get it. And the early monks are personified in these texts by the figure of Shariputra. That's the Sanskrit version of Sariputta. That's his Pali name. Sariputta is the Buddha's one of the Buddha's 2 chief disciples, and he's a teacher himself who brings students to stream entry. And the Buddha's other chief disciple, Moggallana, brings stream enterers to arahantship. So um, Sariputta gets them in the door, and then Moggallana finishes them off. And Sariputta is known as the marshal of the Dhamma, and he's known as the foremost in wisdom. And so it makes sense that he's chosen to be the one to represent the early order, to represent the old order of monks. But Sariputta in the Pali Canon is, is like unimpeachably profound, enlightened, wise. He's a deeply analytical teacher. His texts are quite dense. He's very clear, and really confident in what he knows. In the Perfection of Wisdom texts, Shariputra, now using his Sanskrit name, is the fall guy, and he becomes a kind of straw man figure for the early monks. Shariputra is the one who doesn't quite get it, and so the teaching happens in a kind of layered way, where the Buddha is there, present, but doesn't say very much. But based on the power of the Buddha's enlightenment, the Bodhisattva Subhuti, who's kind of the senior Bodhisattva, the teacher Bodhisattva, Subhuti gives teachings, and every once in a while he checks in with the Buddha and says, Lord, did I get it right? And the Buddha always says, like, you got it right. So the Buddha just emanates the teaching. Subhuti gives the teaching in words, and Shariputra is kind of like us. Shariputra asks the question, but what about this? What about that? How does this mean this? And this is important because you need to be able to investigate a teaching like this, because it's difficult and it uses words in complex ways. And so these, like the early Buddhist texts as well in the Pali Canon, and like many other texts of this era, like Plato's stories of Socrates, these are dialogue texts. So they're telling about a gathering at Vulture Peak with the Buddha, Subhuti teaching, Shariputra asking questions, and a whole host of other bodhisattvas. And there's others present that also speak. So last week we talked about this fundamental teaching that begins the text. This is kind of in the beginning of chapter 1 of the Perfection of Wisdom in 8,000 lines. And in it, the Buddha says to Subhuti, teach how bodhisattvas should practice, essentially. How should they sit? How should they stand? How should they control their thoughts? And how do they course in perfect wisdom? And Subhuti immediately deconstructs the words, and he says, I don't see any such dharma. Here, dharma means like phenomena or thing or experience, identifiable entity. I don't see any such dharma as bodhisattva, nor do I see any such dharma as perfection of wisdom or coursing, right, or practicing. So how should I instruct the bodhisattvas in practicing the perfection of wisdom? So his very first response to the Buddha, and it's a bit of a trick. The Buddha says, good, you understand. Because his first response, to set the whole text in motion, to set this whole second turning of the wheel in motion, is to say that we're going to talk about this, but there's a problem right from the beginning, which is that the words are not helpful. He's not saying, he doesn't come out and say, there's no such thing as a bodhisattva. He says, I don't see, or I don't give rise to the perception of a being known as a bodhisattva. And so what we find then is I want to encourage us to think about this not as a conversation about what exists, but a conversation about what can be spoken of. So here's Subhuti's first, here's that first exchange. The Lord has said, "Make it clear now, Subhuti, to the Bodhisattvas, the great beings, starting from perfect wisdom, how the Bodhisattvas, the great beings, go forth into perfect wisdom." When one speaks of a Bodhisattva, what Dharma does that word Bodhisattva denote? This is Subhuti speaking. "I do not, O Lord, see that Dharma, quote, Bodhisattva, unquote, nor a Dharma called, quote, perfect wisdom, unquote. Since I neither find, nor apprehend, nor see a Dharma, Bodhisattva, nor a perfect wisdom, what Bodhisattva shall I instruct and admonish in what perfect wisdom? And yet, O Lord, if when this is pointed out, a Bodhisattva's heart does not become cowed nor stolid, does not despair nor despond, if they do not turn away or become dejected, etc., etc., it is just this Bodhisattva, this great being, who should be instructed in perfect wisdom. It is precisely this that should be recognized as the perfect wisdom of that Bodhisattva, as their instruction in perfect wisdom. When they thus stand firm, that is their instruction and admonition. Moreover, when a Bodhisattva courses in perfect wisdom and develops it, they should train themselves so they do not pride themselves on that thought of enlightenment. We'll get back to the thought of enlightenment in a moment. That thought is no thought, since in its essential original nature, thought is transparently luminous. So I don't see a Dharma called Bodhisattva. I don't see a Dharma called perfect wisdom. How should I instruct the Bodhisattvas in that? But the Bodhisattva who isn't afraid when I say this is a Bodhisattva, and their training is in the apprehending of this. So this is a teaching about emptiness. Emptiness is the mark by which we recognize that there's not a permanent, eternal, individual, separate entity present in anything, including beings, that we're all process rather than entity. And so we can't be separated from the world around us. And Subhuti understands that the thing that separates, the blade that cuts beings off from understanding themselves as being completely inseparable from everything else, that the sword that does that cutting is language. It's the name of the thing, right? So if a being is a bodhisattva, right, because they've given rise to a thought of enlightenment, that thought of enlightenment, it's like the desire to become fully awakened, to serve all beings. It's the you give rise in your own heart to the conception of freedom and kind of point the heart toward that. That's this giving rise to the thought of enlightenment. One who has done that is a bodhisattva. But if we fixate on, or even really give much weight to the word bodhisattva, we create a world where there are bodhisattvas and not bodhisattvas, where there are people who have given rise to the thought of enlightenment and people who have not. And if we create the conception, the perfection of wisdom, we must also then have the conception of when the perfection of wisdom is absent, right? The imperfection of wisdom, or not the perfection of wisdom. Any word contains, by implication, its opposite, right? Any word that defines something creates a boundary that cuts off what it defines from what it's not referring to, what it refers to from what it's not referring to. So if I emphasize that I'm Sean the teacher, and I look at you and you are a person of your name, the student, if I give rise to the conception that uses those words, I've strengthened in a way, or emphasized, I've brought our attention to the boundary between us. And the idea that there's a distinct dharma happening here called teacher, and a distinct dharma happening there called student, and a distinct dharma here called Sean, and etc. And Subhuti is saying, I'm not giving rise to those conceptions. And the text goes on like this for a while, teasing apart how we use language if we are uh, understanding in such a radical way that that language is empty of solidified meanings. Shariputra asks the question, that thought which is no thought, is that something which is? So Shariputra wants to know about existence. Okay, so this is a thought that is not a thought, right? Remember, Subhuti says, that thought, the thought of enlightenment, it is no thought, since in its essential original nature, thought is transparently luminous. Thought is profoundly insubstantial, right? It appears based in conditions. It's the most insubstantial of our experiences. Actions that impact others are far more solid. Speech that impacts others is far more solid. A thought is like a wisp of conception that defines the world for a moment, and then flickers away. And it defines the world by using concepts that are contingent. They're contextual. They are, based in conditions. It uses words that were invented in the context of culture to refer to things in a conventional way. But none of those things can be seen to be truly, none of the words can be seen to be truly definitive of that thing. A word can never actually define a thing because there's no thing there to be defined. So the words are always provisional. And because of that, Subhuti says thought inherently is transparently luminous, right? It's just like, it's a flash. It's a flash that illuminates something, but there's nothing solid there to grasp at. So Shariputra, the straw man figure here, the fall guy, he says, is that thought which is no thought something that exists? Subhuti, does there exist, or can one apprehend in this state of absence of thought either a there is or a there is not? So, okay, thought is transparently luminous. The thought of enlightenment is no thought. When you're in a state of no thought, Subhuti brings in states. He said, okay, when you're in a state of no thought, is there the thought, this is or this is not, this exists or this doesn't exist? Shariputra, who is an expert at meditative states, says no, right? And here is a hint that I think can be really helpful for us. It's tempting to take this talk about the emptiness of language into a really conceptual deconstruction kind of way. Oh, all language falls apart. All language is contingent, doesn't really refer to anything solid. And you can think about that, but it's difficult for that thought to become liberating until you actually have an experience of thought being transparently luminous. And I think to do this, you need to touch into the state that these two beings are talking about, the state of no thought. So this is in part talking about samadhi, right? The states where thought is paused, is really quieted down. These are the deep states of jhana, of samadhi, of absorption. Right? We know from the early texts, Shariputra is an expert in these, the formed states and the formless states. And if we remember back, we talked about this sutta we've talked about it a couple times this year. I mentioned it a couple weeks ago, I think when we started on this topic. We did a deeper discussion of it maybe a year ago. Um, Majjhima 121, the shorter discourse on emptiness, the Chula Sunyata Sutta. This is one of the first places where in the early text, the Pali Canon, where the Buddha really talks about emptiness, and he talks about it as absence that is peaceful. So he says, look, in this hall there are no horses. This hall is empty of the perception of horses. In the same way, this wilderness where we are practicing, it's empty of the sensory perceptions of the city. The city is busy, dusty, dirty, loud, jangly. But out here in the wilderness, where those sensory perceptions are absent, right? There's no city here in the woods. The absence of that sensory stimulus can be felt, and it goes in the direction of peacefulness. And the Buddha gives several layers of this, where you can compare a more peaceful state to a less peaceful state. And you can say, in the less peaceful state, there are these qualities. There's qualities of stress or anxiety or thought, something like that, or the attention is pulled out to some sensory thing. And then you compare it to a state where there's less anxiety, less thought, less sensory pull. And you say, oh, this state is empty of those stressors. So in practice, I would encourage us to notice moments that are less stressful, less busy, less impacted by all the dramas. And to notice that in those moments, those dramas, those stressors are absent. So it's not just gratitude for like, finally it's peaceful. Thank God all the people went away, whatever. All the, I got to 0 in my email inbox. Now I can finally be peaceful. But it's not just gratitude for the peacefulness, but actually seeing or sensing absence. And when you know the absence of a stressor, you can rest more and more deeply into a state that's free of thought, free of various kinds of distraction. And so right here at the beginning of this deconstruction of language, Subhuti tells Shariputra that it has something to do with the state of no thought. And they're talking about it in a kind of philosophically abstract way. But if thought is empty, transparently luminous, what happens if we take that as a meditation instruction and we actually look at thought through that lens? So try this out right where you are without doing anything called meditation, unless you want to. Think about something on purpose. So you might think about something we're talking about here, or just think about something going on in your life. Think a few sentences worth of words. So now as you do it on purpose, and it's always a little awkward to think on purpose, right? So much thought happens unconsciously as distraction. But as you think on purpose, now do it again and notice how insubstantial the thoughts are. See if you can notice that they're kind of words that have a sort of shimmering, that's my word, see what adjective you would give them. What are thoughts actually like? What is a thought? See if you can come up with an adjective or two to describe a thought. What do you notice? Either drop a word or two in the chat, or if you want to unmute and just say what you notice. You'll be on the recording if you do, but either way. What's thought like?
Feathers in the air.
Yeah, feathers in the air, you said? Yeah. Yeah. There's a lightness to them, a very thin fabric. Yeah. Amorphous. Water reflecting on the surface while moving. Wordplay, for sure. For sure.
When you look at it directly, it disappears.
There's that too, right? Even thinking on purpose, you have to kind of do it without looking closely at it or really concentrate on say, like sometimes when I try to do it, I can't do it. And the only words I can come up with are, I am trying to come up with a thought now. I'll just say a sentence about what I'm doing. Um, but if you try to actually like let the mind go into a story or a narrative, and then you look at it, um, all of these adjectives like thin, amorphous, reflecting, um, it just dissolves very easily. And so I think this is part of what Subhuti means by saying it's transparently luminous. What when you say a word in your mind, and you can try the same thing with images, by the way. The mind thinks in words and images most prominently, and they feel different. So maybe think an image. Think about somewhere you were earlier today, somewhere that's not in your current visual field, and see the image with your inner eye, and then see yourself seeing it. Like reflect on like what's that image like? And again, how would you describe it? I particularly can get a sense of the kind of the the luminous quality of thought when I do image. It's almost like I'm looking at a slide or a cell on a movie film strip that it's almost like I can see light through it because it has to shine with some kind of, you can see colors, right? If you see colors when you see images, but something has to illuminate it. What is that?
For me, the image was much more stable than the thought. Like I could continue to see it, and it seemed more substantial.
Hmm.
Like I can see it now, even with my eyes open. It's this image of the deck pot with the flowers. I can see the color. So that had more of a substantial sense to it than the thought words.
Yeah, yeah. Both of these will eventually become practices, of course, and they get really taken up in the Vajrayana and the Mantrayana. Um, using thought, you have practices like memorization of texts, where you're repeating texts over and over, and of course, mantra, where you're repeating very short texts over and over and over. And you start to see that the text is luminous and empty, but also gathers the mind and moves a certain kind of power depending on what it is. And much later on will be said to be like the body of the divinity even. And then of course you get practices like visualization where you hold an image in the mind and you assemble that image in detail over time. Uh, in both cases, you have to keep repeating it so that it doesn't fade. There's a repeated application of attention, but uh, they can both be stable. But I think it's true for a lot of folks that because an image is like a snapshot, and maybe this is true for us who are used to looking at snapshots, um, we can hold the image as a kind of steady thing for longer than we can the words, because the words, they disappear as soon as you say them. You know, they're like writing on the water, it's said sometimes. Right. So fleeting, filmy, ethereal. When I call it, this is all from the chat. When I call an image to mind, it's often a mix of what I've actually seen and something made up, like a mix of moments made into something I never actually experienced. Uh, that term uh, for AI right now, where they say it hallucinates, right? It mixes facts with made up stuff. The mind, I think that's actually a really good word for what AI does because it's a word for what I does, what intelligence does. The mind, the perceptual mind, fills in the gaps in perception. And the mind really doesn't like not knowing what a certain perception is. And so it will define the perception even if it has no idea what it is. And some of the most interesting studies on this are the split brain studies, where for various reasons, to save a person's life or stabilize their condition in some seizure syndromes and others, they've done surgeries to cut the corpus callosum, which is the communicative channel between the left and right hemispheres of the brain that also govern spatially what we see on left and right sides. And they've done experiments where a researcher will stand on one side of a person and say, "I would like you to just like lift and wave your hand," and the person does it, and the researcher will walk over to their other side, so they're talking to the other side of their brain. They say, "Why did you just wave your hand?" And the person says, "Oh, I thought I saw someone I knew." And the brain, I'll say mind, I'll say brain, who knows what the overlap is between them in this conversation, but the mind does not like to not know what it's seeing. And so this is the faculty of recognition, and recognition uses words very often, and it will stitch together a meaning even if it doesn't know one. So, you know, when we see something and we really don't know what it is, the attention will fixate on it and it will form into something, right? Some idea will come of what it is. Last night, my partner and I were laying outside in the finally cool air on a little daybed on our deck, resting, looking at the stars, and there was some rustling in the bushes nearby, and it was nearly impossible not to focus on the rustling and wonder what it was. And we had a look. It was probably a fox, but we had a little conversation of like, is it a fox? Is it a possum? Is it a skunk? You know, it's probably not a squirrel from the sound. We're really going through, but I could notice the way that my mind did not want to not know. And so it was really listening for like the exact volume and the thump as whatever it was sort of landed, it sounded like it landed in the leaves and it scurried. And so much activity in the recognition channels was going toward trying to find a word for what it was, because it's difficult for us to relax with not knowing. And so in the emptiness teaching, we're going to get this challenge to the idea that the word accurately describes the phenomena and that it's something that you can rely on. What bodhisattva is here, and what perfect wisdom should I instruct them in? And so, we are, we have this attempt to destabilize conventional concepts. And so, yeah, there's a question or a reflection in the chat around, religion being a way to address the discomfort of life. I think that very commonly it is. And the explanations given by religions often are ways to talk about phenomena or feelings or intuitions that we don't have other language for. Why would we talk about, a God having done a certain action or granting us a certain grace, to say, oh, I can just feel the grace of God as I do this difficult thing in my life. What's happening when we use that kind of language, right? We're calling upon a concept that orients us in a difficult moment, and it's partly a concept neurologically that gives comfort because it gives me a way to explain what's happening. And and it points to myths and stories that are deep, right? That are very um, uh, that really create the fabric of our psyche, that is communal, that it's tied in with the ancestors. How we know who we are is, these various stories, um, and and narratives. Um, and so I want to bring in one phrase here, um, uh, and um, I like this phrase a lot. It's a phrase referring to certain turns of phrase or speech that have the effect of cutting off further development of a conversation. And these are things like c'est la vie, you know, it is what it is. Um, you know, isn't everything like this? You can whatever flavor, uh, of of phrase that that your culture uses. You'll know several of these, and I recently heard this beautiful phrase for them, and they're called thought terminating cliches. It's a thought terminating cliche. So when somebody's talking about something and you can't really explain it and you don't really know where to go from here, you just say, you know, um, ain't it just like that? Or, it's all a mystery, isn't it? Um, or, or you just say humans, right? Any of these, they're cliches because they can be deployed in almost any conversational circumstance. And they are thought terminating because um, because they're mostly radical, all-encompassing finalities. And so uh, the the teaching here, the way that Subhuti is responding to the Buddha, you know, what does this word even mean? Um, is a kind of thought terminating cliche. So the Mahāyāna uses this to short circuit our obsession with meaning and with fitting things into recognizable categories. Um, so uh, uh, Subhuti, cuts into Shariputra's attempt to understand, by undercutting the question. Um, so a little ways down the way, Subhuti, I who do not find anything to correspond to the word bodhisattva or to the words perfect wisdom, which bodhisattva should I then instruct and admonish in which perfect wisdom? Um, A bodhisattva who does not become afraid when this deep and perfect wisdom is being taught. Well, I just skipped a bit. I'm going to go back. I'm just going to read this to you. So here uh, listen to the words, but notice the felt sense that this gives when we read it. It would surely be regrettable if I, unable to find the thing itself, should merely in words cause a bodhisattva to arise and to pass away. Moreover, what is thus designated is not continuous, nor non-continuous, not discontinuous, nor not discontinuous. So continuous or discontinuous is a way of saying, does this thing have boundaries or not? What is this thing that we're defining, and how are we defining it within certain bounds? Um, why? Because it does not exist. Right? What is the thing that doesn't exist? Bodhisattva, the referent of that word, right? It's a word. The word creates boundaries. It's creating a bounded, discontinuous entity that doesn't exist. That is why it is not continuous nor discontinuous, etc. A bodhisattva who does not become afraid when this deep and perfect wisdom is being taught should be recognized as not lacking in perfect wisdom. So if you're not afraid of this, when we say it, if you're not afraid of how this deconstructs language and meaning, then you've got it, that thing which cannot be named. as standing at the irreversible stage of a bodhisattva, standing firmly in consequence of not taking their stand anywhere. A bodhisattva who courses in perfect wisdom and develops it, put a bookmark on that. You still have to develop this, right? That's mysterious. We'll talk about that in a minute. Should not take a stand in form, etc. Form, etc. means the 5 khandhas or skandhas: form, feeling, perceptions, formations, or consciousness. You don't take a stand in any of those, because if you take a stand in any of them, you're not coursing in perfect wisdom. For in perfect wisdom, form is not appropriated, etc., etc., through the skandhas. This concentrated insight of the bodhisattva is called the non-appropriation of all dharmas. The state of all knowledge itself cannot be taken hold of because it cannot be seized through a sign. So to name something and box it and boundary it is a way of appropriating it, to take hold of it and to take a stand somewhere. Right? So with all of that language, we have the sense of like, oh, it's almost like you're shrinking yourself down, or you're shrinking your conception of the universe down to say, oh, we're going to take a stand in this one place. Bodhisattvas are like this. We're going to think of form and feelings as being like this. And when you do not do that, when you don't solidify any of those, then you are, that's where you take a stand. You take a stand by not taking a stand. The challenge for this, for practice, of course, and you'll get this already, undoubtedly, many of you are already like, yes, but-ing this argument, which is that this is all well and good as a meditative state. And I think it's important to understand that if we're talking about a state that is no thought, that is non-conceptual, that is beyond all of these concepts and boundaries, that this is primarily a meditative state that they're talking about, the state of no thought that was mentioned. But they're teaching it, they're not talking about it as a meditative state very much. They're talking about it as an orientation to existence. And in that sense, there's the understanding that this emptiness can be how you live your life. This is how bodhisattvas, the Diamond Sutra will say, how do bodhisattvas sit? How do they stand? How do they control their thoughts? The sitting and standing is the how you live your life, how you move around, how you do all your stuff. And of course, we've already heard in this text that bodhisattvas have to train. You have to train in this. And so how do we live our lives from this perspective? How do you act in the world from this perspective, right? Because you're not just going around saying, I refuse to admit that words mean anything. I refuse to take a stand for anything in the world in the relative sense. All social positions are empty. All views are empty. All use of language is too confining for me. That almost certainly, right? If anyone starts talking like that, especially if you're in close relationship with them or political alliance or anything, you should run away, because that's spiritual. That's what's called spiritual bypass. Using the language of the non-dual to avoid responsibility or accountability for actual harm and impact and choices in the world. So the paradox here is that the thing that makes bodhisattvas bodhisattvas is their care for beings. Right? If you didn't care for other beings, you would just enter nirvana and be done. If we go with the old Mahāyāna critique of the early system, you could just become an arhat and not get reborn, and you're done. But you became a bodhisattva because you vowed to become a Buddha one day in order to save beings. So you care for beings. And as you know, of course, the quintessential, archetypal bodhisattva emotion is compassion, is caring for beings in their suffering. And so, uh, how do we hold these two aspects of Bodhisattva training? One is a training in deeply deconstructing language so that you no longer believe the, the constricted boundaries that, discursive language builds. But at the same time, you do not forget beings. You do not forget living beings and their suffering. In our sharing time after the meditation and before this talk, we did that group blessing, offering blessings to various folks. Take a moment and remember that. And remember the feeling of sitting in the circle, right? Or if you're watching this later, and remember a time when you were sitting in a circle, giving blessings for beings, wishing that people would be safe and safe from harm, wishing that humans and animals and beings would be well, sending loving kindness, sending compassion. Remember that feeling. And then connect that feeling with the feeling of the deep spaciousness of thoughts, the luminosity of thoughts that we touched into before. That the words are thin, transparent, luminous, shimmering, like water, right? They don't really point to distinct entities. Even if we say, somebody very specific, if I say, may my sister be well, and I have that wish, may she be well, there's the feeling of compassion, wishing for this distinct human being to be well. And then there's the understanding, right, the insight of the perfection of wisdom that understands that the designation my and the designation sister, and of course I can see her image and think of her name, that all of those things are thoughts that are luminous and thin and that flicker away as soon as I look at them. Because what is she? What is any human being? A web of connections. I mostly remember my sister when she was little, because once we were teenagers, we didn't have as much interaction. And so I see her now as adults, but the image that's really burned into me is of us as children. And where is that child now, right? Our parents are dead. She's elsewhere. We're different people, maybe. It was all, even the image is like a shimmering snapshot of a moment that half existed and half didn't exist, right? I don't actually remember exactly the moment. I just have a flash of, oh, there's that image of us on like, Easter Sunday standing outside the church. And I know this because we have a photograph of this. So I see the photograph, but then the photograph has us as real people in it, but we kind of shimmer and dissolve because that's what the mental image is like. It's empty. And so Bodhisattva practice asks us to hold the uh, compassion, which understands the relative reality of boundaries. This is where that teaching on the two truths comes in, right? We'll talk about this more soon. Where the Bodhisattva understands that beings suffer. Beings have life stories and wants and dreams, and they suffer, and they get liberated through practice. But the Bodhisattva is a Bodhisattva because they also know, as a very deep insight, the emptiness of thoughts, particularly language and story that we use to box people in, or that the stories that wrap around people as these kind of shimmering barriers between themselves and the rest of existence. And it's going to start to unfold in these teachings that it's the barrier itself that is creating suffering. It's the concept, me and you, self and other, that's going to be the heart, of course, of relational suffering. right? Again, don't fall off the knife edge into nihilism. Spiritual bypass is a kind of nihilism because it says that nothing matters because everything is, fill in the blank with your favorite monistic philosophical term, right? Everything is full, everything is divine, everything is empty. That's fine, right? Bodhisattvas know that, but they never forget beings. And so then here, this is the beautiful kind of shimmering paradox that we're going to tease out as these as this line of thought, is developed. But at the heart of the line of thought is not just a radical deconstructive philosophy. Deconstruction 2,000 years before European deconstruction arrived. It's not just that. It's also an accurate somatic reference to a state of meditation that is absolutely free of thought, free of discriminative dividing, right? A state of heart-mind where there is just the peace and ease of the absence of the stress of division, the absence of the stress created by the language and the concepts that create division. In meditation, you can taste that, and then you understand that that's how it is, and that all use of language and boundary is provisional. And it's provisional, but still useful because you care about beings, because you care about their suffering. All right, so we'll pause there. Thank you for listening and not listening and letting the words, as the Tibetans would say, self-liberate. As soon as they're said, they're gone. So they've self-liberated. You don't even have to do anything about it.